So why don't we start? I would like to welcome you all to this panel event. A very exciting panel because it's the first in a series of webinars about work and AI. It's a joint workshop between the Oxford Internet Institute and TUM campus in Heilbronn. And we think that the topic of AI and work and the issues, which skills are necessary and which skills and different skills might be less necessary and which more is worth your next hour, which we will spend on that various topic. First of all, I would like to introduce the various panelists and very modestly start with myself and why is TUM campus Heilbronn involved in that series. At that TUM campus in Heilbronn, we find that for the digital age is an interesting combination where we need to intertwine management and digital technologies, look at family enterprises and the intergenerational sustainability, enable people with a new skill or a stronger skill in the design mindset, and then really look into the issues of international connectedness. And that's why we have joined forces with the Oxford Internet Institute. My name is Helmut Krcmar. I'm the founding dean and presidential delegate for TUM campus Heilbronn, and also here in my role as managing director of the TUM campus Heilbronn Limited, which actually runs the international interconnectedness. And also welcome Daniel Gottschalk, my co-MD. And with that, I would like to pass on for short introductions to Neuburger.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm Rachel Neuburger. I work at the LMU, at the Munich School of Management, at the LMU Munich, and there at the Research Center for Information Organization and Management. And I'm general manager of the Münchner Kreis and coordinate the working group Work for Digital World.
Next one is Dr. Frey.
Good afternoon, good morning, everyone, depending on where you are. My name is Frey. I'm an economist by background, and I run the program on the future of work here at the Oxford Martin School, Oxford University, where we're looking at how digital technologies like AI is transforming the world of work.
Last but not finally, last but not least.
Hello, everybody. Very nice to see such a good participation today. My name is Lehdonvirta. That's a Finnish name. I'm originally from Finland, but I've been in Oxford for almost 10 years now. I'm professor of economic sociology and digital social research at the Oxford Internet Institute. Looking forward to the discussion.
So thanks for the introduction. Now you know the panel, and I will change hats and go into a different role. Neuburger already mentioned the MÜNCHNER KREIS, or Munich Circle, a think tank organization in Germany. And about 2 years ago, we conducted a study on AI and work. I can report that because I'm also the member of the board of Munich Circle and the chairman of the research committee. And when we got chartered to do that study by the publishers and supporters from Bosch to SAP to many others involved, their focus was to look at AI and work, solely AI and work. And we were strongly reminded that we should, as researchers, focus on these aspects. It soon turned out that if you do that, then you immediately realize that once you look into work, it has to do a lot with work-life balance or work-life relationships. And once you look at the dynamic character of work, you will have to look at the educational system. And that's why the study got its actual title, to look at work, life, work, and education 2035 under the conditions of artificial intelligence technologies and their impact on that. How did we go about the study? What we actually did is that we had an online expert Delphi study in 2 waves, where many of the experts and companies helped us formulate hypotheses. Then the classic Delphi study of 513 people actually participating. And of course, the ongoing material you can download. You'll get the download link in a minute. What I would like to share now are selected findings on 3 questions. The first one is, how will AI technologies actually change routines and collaboration in the workplace? And if you look at the following results, we brought you along thesis number 8 and thesis number 14 out of 50 some that we had. One is to look at people will have a greater confidence in AI-supported analysis results and recommendations for actions than in those of human colleagues. That we will trust our AI systems more than we might trust our colleagues. And we asked the Delphi participants, when do you think, if at all, will that be reality? So here we see people think 2030 to 2035, 31% people say it will be. 24 see it even earlier, and likely never is a relatively small number. On the other side, we asked, in companies, since large parts of the decisions is driven by AI technologies, management is mainly responsible for personnel management, motivation, and creative performance. And you see a slightly different picture. About a quarter of the participants said likely never, and they have a much different time distribution. So what we can conclude from that, and we will see that later on, is that employees and employers will have to shape the function of AI in the workplace and combine the technology with the social and creative skills of the individual as a design necessity. Another incident and selected finding that I would like to share with you is, how will AI change which skills are required in the workplace? And I know that we will have another panelist going to the topic, so we can engage in an immediate debate. So what will the skills change actually be? One is to say that cognitive demanding and creative jobs dominate the labor market, resulting in an unprecedented war for talents. On the other side, we asked ourselves, is every employee, in our case in Germany, going to have a basic AI qualification? Now you know the game. We look at the time distribution, and interestingly enough, the assumption of many of the panelists is that the job profiles will change relatively quickly. If you add the numbers up, about 70% of the skills will have changed till 2035. That seems long, but if you have an average work time or work life of about 40 years, to have that done in the next 13 years means it's under-generational change. On the other hand side, we also see that in terms of qualification, that will be much later. So new jobs will dominate the labor markets, and the necessary AI qualifications will arrive relatively late. So it's important that policymakers and organizations have to counteract the threats of the skills shortage and skills inequality that might develop in the workforce. Let's go on to a third finding. Will AI change the way we educate and learn? You remember we had work, life, and education. So here we asked, AI technologies have dissolved the existing educational system. And in Germany, AI technologies have taken a large part of family learning. In terms of the educational system, we were very surprised, honestly, to see that the educational system seems to be extremely stable, likely never taken over by AI technologies, whereas in the family learning case, it's much more expected than things like tutoring, knowledge transfer of children and other people will create. So we are called upon as a society to really find out in our educational policy setting, which opportunities of AI-based learning can we actually do. Now, if you think that's enough of input for the panel, let me also share a few insights on what did the COVID pandemic actually do then? Because we did the study right at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, so we did an extra study jointly with Bertelsmann Foundation to find out whether the COVID pandemic has an influence on how AI as a technology will be perceived. Some people even feared that's over with this AI technology. Well, the respondents told us that they assume that virtual conferencing and mobile work, as we know by now, will be a major change, but there are many other areas where they don't see change happening rapidly. When we asked them how will the COVID pandemic affect the importance and development of AI technologies, well, whether it's in healthcare, which is actually the largest part on the left-hand side, or in AI-based business models, everybody thought change continuing. And if you go into more detail, there even also that the change is strongly accelerating or acceleration. So when we look at the various inputs and what AI use or use of AI technology all changes in our life, work, and education, then it's going to happen even faster than we thought. Let me summarize in key findings. The AI-induced changes in our social life, in the workplace, and in the education system are closer than we think. Many people thought it will be way out, but with the acceleration by the pandemic, as well as with the expectation that things will be useful pretty early, that's an interesting finding. This results in a variety of implications and design issues for the individual and society, which we still have to talk about. One reason to have a series between TUM Campus Heilbronn and Oxford Internet Institute on AI and work. And that also gives us, this dialogue, the opportunity to shape the future use of AI in a way that it is coalescent with the issues of all the stakeholders. Should I have made you interested in more material? Luckily, the webinar made us finish the English translation of the studies, and it will be available on the website in German and English. And I hope that you got insights into what else can be looked at. And with that, I'd like to hand on to the next panelist. I checked it just in time. So thanks for listening and enjoy the next presentation. I stop mine.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now I will present. I hope you can see it. The right one? Okay. So I will talk about the competences. We have learned a lot about education, about the changing of the work process and the necessity to develop new and modified competences. Because we all know AI is changing the way we live, we work, we communicate, and interact with each together. This is not new, but AI is a new element in the working context. AI is not a technology which is simply operated by humans as all technologies, or AI is a self-learning, adapting system which leads to new tasks, to new roles, to new jobs. We have heard it. And AI changed the division of labor between human and AI. So we can see new tasks. We have people who develop and program AI, employees who train AI, and more employees who use and apply AI. For example, the use of chatbots, or the co-working with robots, or the use of HR systems as recruiting systems, and so on. So the collaboration between AI and human will be changed. We can see it here. The advantage of AI lies in the penetration and the mastery of data complexity and the handling of planned and predictable tasks. And while the advantage of human lies in the penetration and mastering of the context complexity and the handling of unstructured and not predictable tasks. So in the future, there will be tasks which will be replaced by AI. Oh, here, okay, sorry, will be replaced by AI. There are tasks which will be supported and augmented by AI, and there will be tasks which will be handled only by human. And perhaps here are many potentials for new jobs and new possibilities for human work. So we see new tasks, we see new roles, we see a new and changed division of labor, and we need new competencies and modified competencies. And this is my second slide. Which competencies do we need? Firstly, I think for all people who are in contact with AI, a basic understanding of AI in the working context is necessary. Understanding of the possibilities of AI and the possibilities for introduction of AI in the working context, and the development of awareness of AI. So for employees who develop, program, and train AI, specialized IT competencies are necessary for understanding, developing, training systems as basic IT and programming skills, big data skills, data analysis, data science, because data is the basis of AI, and specialized knowledge in deep learning and machine learning, special of the types and the kinds and the possibilities of deep learning. So secondly, I think we need human-machine interaction competences for collaboration and co-working with AI systems. Which skills are required is depending on the role, so programming, training, or using. So perhaps developer and programmer needs tools for training of algorithms, and the user needs competences for the application as using the using of the HR system, or using or applying the chatbot, or co-working with the robot. So, but I think for all it's necessary to develop cognitive competencies as reflection, assessment capability, learning capability, and so on. So to understand, or for understanding the suggestions of the AI and the functions of the AI. But there are not only technical competences which are necessary in the world with AI, as the working world. So we need personal and social competences for working in the changing co-working context with AI. For example, self-responsibility and self-organization is necessary if AI takes over routine tasks and the employees have to focus on non-routine activities which need more self-responsibility, or creativity. We have heard this, and experimentation for solutions for the not predictable tasks. And I think it's very important to develop empowerment and leadership skills, because AI is a new element in the working context and is an unknown element. So it's necessary to understand the fears of AI and the fears of replacement of the own job. Finally, not finally, and we need process and strategic competences for adapting the changing processes due to AI, and for solving of complex tasks. We have seen it in the slide before. There is a field for tasks which be handled only by humans, and for these tasks, competencies as process solution competencies, or what process and knowledge is necessary. And I think it's very important that we think about the need to maintain specific skills should not be neglected even if the AI can better accomplish these tasks. If employees lose the corresponding skills as a result of the introduction of AI, this can become critical. So, for example, the taking over of customer orders or customer requests if the chatbot doesn't work, or the adjusting the production process if the robot does work, or when the robot doesn't work. So we need so-called firefighter competencies. These are competencies for tasks which are handled by AI, but we have as a challenge that we have to do these tasks if when the AI doesn't work. So summarizing a discussion of the future competencies that employees will need in the future of work with AI should consider technical competencies, non-technical competencies, and firefighter competencies. Thank you very much for your attention. And then I hand it over to
Thank you very much. So let me continue by adding a footnote to what Dr. Neuburger just said, because a lot has been said already. But I do think that looking at how some of these transformations will shape the geography of work is quite complementary, because if you look historically of how people adjusted to technological change, it's often been either by acquiring new skills and occupational mobility, or by moving between places, and that's geographical mobility. And I think it's important to keep in mind that the impact of technological revolutions, which we're currently in the midst of one with regard to artificial intelligence, they've always been uneven. During the first industrial revolutions, factories were unheard of where Jane Austen resided, whereas in the north, domestic industry was left shattered. If we look at the geography of robots today, we see a similar pattern. In the United States, for example, there are more robots in Michigan alone than in the entire American West. The same is true if you look at Germany, the UK, and so on. The impact of these technologies have been highly clustered. One of the favorite lines from my book is that if you put one hand in the freezer and the other on the stove, you should be feeling quite comfortable on average. But we know from experience that that is not the case, right? And the same is true when it comes to the impact of these technologies on employment. If you zoom in on some of the communities which have seen factories close down, jobs being automated away, you do find those communities significantly adversely impacted. And every manufacturing job that is being automated away also means additional job loss in the local service economy, because each manufacturing worker used to spend his or her income on going grocery shopping, going to the hairdresser, and so on and so forth. And that created on balance 1.6 additional jobs in the local service economy. So we shouldn't be too surprised if we see that some communities also seeing a lot of bad social consequences as a result of this transformation. When jobs dry up, public services tend to deteriorate. You see increases in crime, worsening health outcomes, and so on and so forth. And quite naturally, as a consequence, many people in those communities are opting for political change, often radical alternatives. We see that both in Europe and in the United States. At the same time, though, we see a lot of new jobs emerging as a result of computer technologies and artificial intelligence. It's not just about replacement, as Dr. Neuburger just said, it's about jobs being transformed and new jobs being created along the way. But quite often, those jobs are not emerging in the same places where the old ones are being replaced. And that has increasingly been the case since the computer revolution, which took off in the 1980s. When we look at new jobs emerging, we see that beginning in the 1980s in the US, and this is also true for Europe, by the way, you see that those job titles have come increasingly clustered in cities with an abundance of workers with cognitive skills. Indeed, as we all know, places like Silicon Valley, places like New York, places like Munich have transformed and benefited hugely from the new computer industries and that have emerged. And on balance, every new tech job creates more demand for local services and creates 5 new jobs in the local economy there. So you can see the imbalance that is happening. We have, places which specialized in routine work, where jobs are disappearing because of computerization and artificial intelligence. And we see a new set of thriving cities where new jobs are emerging and creating new employment, leading to significant spatial inequalities, which is in turn underpinning, I believe, much of the bad social consequences that we are seeing today. And of course, this is quite the opposite from what people predicted. Some of you might be old enough to remember the 1990s when email had just arrived, when the web had just arrived, and everybody were predicting the end of the office and the death of cities. Tom Friedman wrote a book, famously called The World is Flat, in which he predicted that information technology and artificial intelligence eventually, although I didn't talk about AI at that point in time, will eventually allow us to escape the cities and, move to places where housing is cheaper. And as a consequence of that, all of these spatial inequalities will disappear. But obviously, the opposite has happened. And the question is, as we're now having a similar debate, is something different this time around? Do we need to think about policy responses to solve these spatial inequalities, or has the pandemic sorted this for us as we're all moving to remote and more of us are working from home? Now, the reason that we have cities in the first place has to do with the cost of moving goods, people, and ideas. As we all know, transportation costs have already fallen very dramatically throughout the 19th and 20th century, and it's less of a constraint. And we've all seen with ICT technology that the cost of moving ideas has fallen very rapidly as well. And that is something that probably benefited location because it allowed places like Munich and New York to export their services to the world and become more productive as a consequence. But the constraint on face-to-face remained throughout the 1990s and the 2000s. And the question is, to what extent video conferencing and other AI digital technologies will change that? Some of you may know that if you look at, for example, inventive activities like patenting, you see that the distance between inventors has increased dramatically in recent years, suggesting that we can collaborate quite effective in even knowledge activities as things stand today. But I think it's important to remember that all of these collaborators had to meet somewhere in order to form a collaboration in the first place. And we do know from a variety of studies that when important conferences get cancelled, for example, collaboration suffers as a consequence. Fewer teams are formed, fewer new ideas are being pursued. And while we can coordinate some of these activities quite effectively at distance, digital and AI technologies remain poor substitutes for sporadic interactions in particular. You need to plan a meeting in order for it to happen in the virtual world. You don't bump into each other randomly. And so in ongoing work, we are currently looking at how artificial intelligence and other digital technologies is shaping collaboration and what the implications are for the future geography of work. And some preliminary findings do suggest that knowledge spillovers have been reduced in recent decades, but the cities and locations still do matter quite a bit, and that we should still think of digital networks and local networks as complements rather than substitutes, which means that the spatial inequalities that we've seen emerging are unlikely to be reduced to any significant extent by the pandemic itself, which means that if we think that this is a problem, we need to look at policies to address it. Some think that we need a revival of place-based policies to boost employment in places that have been left behind. Others believe that we should rather invest in human capital because, after all, people can take their skills with them, whereas physical capital still stays put. Other, like myself, believes it has more to do with transportation, infrastructure, and housing, and the ability to connect declining and expanding places. To just give you an example, which is close to my heart, in southern Sweden, Malmö was a city that did poorly for a long time, beginning in the 1990s as the shipyard Kockums closed down. Along comes the bridge to Copenhagen, allows people in Malmö to stay put there where housing was cheap, commute into Copenhagen where there was an abundance of well-paying jobs. Most people will spend most of their income locally with where they live, which gave a boost to the local service economy in Malmö, created a virtuous cycle, and it's now one of the most dynamic labor markets in Europe. And I think we need to think more creatively about connecting places that are declining, where housing is cheap, where with expanding labor markets to solve some of these spatial inequalities. And I think that is very complementary to many of the reskilling initiatives, and that are also very much needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carl, for your excellent presentation. And thanks also for audience members for active listening. And we already have a couple of questions up in the Q&A feature. So please feel free to use the Q&A feature to post some questions. And after I've made my little remarks, we will look into what you've posted and we will answer some of those questions with the panel. So my little intervention is I could say it's a footnote to Carl's presentation, and also to some extent to Dr. Neuburger's presentation on future competencies. So let me just show you a very simple picture. Okay, interesting. There you go. So Carl was talking about the way in which automation, technological transformation is eliminating some jobs, eliminating demand for some skills, and complementing some others, and creating new demand for new skills. And often in economic literature, this occupations and skills are conceptualized as this kind of a continuum, a single dimension, that there are low-skilled occupations on the one hand, something like agricultural labor and warehouse work, and then you've got high-skilled occupations. You've got your software developers and doctors and lawyers. And the research literature suggests that often technology and automation, it's a substitute for low-skilled work. So we see reductions, job losses, technological unemployment in sectors like manufacturing, agriculture in the past, and manufacturing. And now most recently with so-called AI technologies, we've got some technological unemployment in the middle-skilled occupations in the middle, sort of hollowing out of the labor market. And then on the other hand, we have skill bias technological change, where the demand for highly skilled workers is only increased by new technologies, not reduced. And from this kind of a single dimension model, the policy advice often is that we need to, as societies and labor markets, we need to upskill, that we need to move people from the lower end of the skills continuum to the high end, teach people digital skills. In the UK, there's been a push to teach programming in schools, for instance, as a one intervention. But the problem with this view of skills and occupations, the single dimensional view, is that it's a bit abstract for actual workplaces, individual workplaces and individual workers. Because if you think about even so-called low-skilled occupations, a warehouse worker or an agricultural worker, in fact, they have many different skills. They can be quite skilled in very specific things. Somebody like me put into a strawberry farm would be terrible at that work, and I would be vastly inferior to somebody with lots of experience in that work who had the chance to develop those skills. So it's not the case that people can simply be categorized as low skilled or high skilled. It's the case that people have different bundles of skills. And I think at workplaces, we can recognize this idea much better, that we have people with different skill sets. And so in this second model of an occupation, you can see an occupation is defined as a vector of skills, that you have a number of different skills pointing in different directions. And an occupation is a bundle of such skills. Then the effect of, in this model, the effect of technological transformation, and most recently of AI, is to substitute for some of those skills whilst complementing some of the other skills. So demand for some of those skills will be reduced, and demand for other skills will increase. And we can, in the case of AI, we could call the skills which are complemented by AI technologies, we could call them AI skills, in scare quotes. And I can draw an equivalence, a loose equivalence here to the future competencies that Dr. Neuburger was talking about. And so the question from a policy perspective becomes not so much, should we upskill people or not? No, I mean, yes, you probably should, but how exactly do you upskill? What skills should people be picking up? So what are those AI skills? And Dr. Neuburger's presentation already identified 4 categories, different types of skills. But also, what are the relevant AI skills for different occupations or even different individual workers? Because the skills that are needed, the AI skills needed by, let's say, lawyers and doctors might be different. We already know that lawyers are to some extent starting to use natural language processing software to find precedent in vast amounts of case material. It's not that lawyers become programmers who develop natural language processing algorithms themselves, but they may benefit from having a working knowledge of how those algorithms work so as to make best use of them. Conversely, doctors, we know, are using image processing software and computer vision to scan chest x-rays, for instance. And again, having a basic understanding, awareness, as Dr. Neuburger called it, of how those technologies work is important for doctors to be able to use them correctly, and so as to avoid some of the pitfalls and shortcomings of those technologies. So the question becomes then, how do we identify the AI skills relevant for each occupation so that we can reskill, we can help people reskill into those skill sets? And I don't have an answer to that question, unfortunately, but I have some preliminary findings that I wanted to share with you. from some research, preliminary research that we've conducted with my colleague, Dr. Fabian Stephany. And we have a data set that doesn't have warehouse workers and doctors and lawyers in it, unfortunately, but it has different kinds of knowledge workers. And so we analyzed close to 15,000 independent professionals, knowledge workers in different occupations. And we looked at the different skills that they describe themselves with. And we tried to identify which AI skills these different occupations need. And we can see, if you look at the top row, the darker colors mean more use of that skill. You can see the data scientists are they're using deep learning, they're using data mining, they're using data visualization, and 100% of them are using natural language processing. But they're not using image processing. That's not that's an AI skill, but it's not an AI skill that appears to be relevant to data scientists in this particular sample. Then on the other hand, you've got software developers, and they also use deep learning, but they don't need data mining or data visualization. Those are something that you would present insights with, but developers are building things. So rather they need deep learning and natural language processing skills to be building things. Then you have consultants, and they're the opposite to software developers. They don't need deep learning, they don't need natural language processing, in this sample at least, but they do need data mining and data visualization, because they're all about digging out those insights from clients' data and visualizing, displaying them to the clients. And interestingly, animators are similar to consultants in the sense that they also need data visualization skills, but they're different to all the other occupations in this selected sample, in that they also need image processing know-how, same as I suspect doctors do. And this is just a selection of 4 different occupations and 5 different skills from a vastly larger space of occupations and skills. But it demonstrates to you this idea that there are AI skills, there are particular skills that are complementary to new AI technologies, and that people will, in different occupations, will benefit from having those AI skills, and workplaces, organizations will benefit from helping people reskill into those skills. But which skills are the relevant AI skills varies by occupation. So one size fits all, let's teach everyone deep learning because that's the hot new thing, is not effective. It's not, and I can see that Dr. Neuburger agrees with me here. And this is a line of research that we hope to pursue further, and perhaps 6 months or 12 months time, I'll have more, or my colleague Dr. Stephany will have more results to share with you on this. But for now, I think I will leave it there. So it's my pleasure now to sort of wrap up this part of the event, and just to sort of summarize, Professor Krcmar shared with us research on identifying the vast impacts of AI on life, work, and education. And Dr. Neuburger focused on future competences, the skills and also soft skills that will be required of workers in a future workplace augmented with AI technologies. My modest contribution is in some ways a footnote to that, identifying what those AI skills might be in different occupations. And then Dr. Frey talked about the geographic distribution in the demand for these new skills. So there will also, these changes will not happen flatly across the globe, but rather be concentrated in specific places. So thank you for everyone for these wonderful contributions. And now we have the opportunity to take some questions from the audience. And the way we'll do that is that I will just pick some questions from here, and I will call, if it's okay with you panelists, I will call on you. I will call on you if you would like to address them. So and also do that myself. And oh yes, and also to audience, I would like to highlight that there's the ability to vote on questions that have already been asked. If there's something that you really want to bring to my attention, you can vote it to the top of the line. And the first question from Hunter Acreage is, what is the role of trade unions and collective bargaining in the introduction of AI technologies into workplace contexts? And this is a very important question, and I also have some thoughts on this, and I suspect that this is something that we'll probably have an opportunity to talk much more about in another event, in another context. But nevertheless, I would like to invite, let's say, Professor Krcmar, if you have any brief remarks on this particular question. What is the role of unions and collective bargaining in all this, please?
I think the role of unions, and I can report the case of the industrial union for metal workers in Germany, is to be part of this debate on whether that leads to work intensification, or as Neuburger has described, to work augmentation, and whether there are specific tasks or subtasks that might be automated and how that results in the overall workforce. In the automotive industry, in the German case, there is a relatively open debate on how AI tools can help make work better in terms of delivering specific tasks to robots, and on the other side, look at for the skills that really described in the specialization for the specific occupations that can be taken over. So that part of the unions and employers are trying to find out what new mixes of skills can actually change the job profiles and how that transition would be actually handled. That doesn't mean that everybody likes the introduction of AI technologies or robots into the workplace, but it's debated as how would that change the composition of the overall workforce. And in this area of war for talent, not having enough workers to do the various jobs, one rethinks that. That is not just in the metal workers union, but also in the union for services and for taking care of people, where these thoughts are being developed. That does, I think it's important to realize that's only a certain amount of people, and Rahel might have in some of our working groups also other representatives of the union side and employer side with different opinions. So there's a large debate going on how to actually do that transformation. And I think that's where the insights on geographic boundedness of skills by people living there, as well as specificness of skills to a specific occupation, is a very good input into this often too global debate.
Thank you very much, Professor Krcmar. Did Dr. Neuburger want to, or Dr. Frey, did you want to add anything to that?
So I think obviously the role of unions very much depends on which country you're looking at. So their power and reach varies enormously. And obviously that is shaping the adoption and adjustment to many of these technologies. So if you look at Los Angeles Harbor, a lot of people went on strike when autonomous cargo trucks were being introduced. When the same technology was introduced in Norway and the Netherlands, I've seen no reports of any type of unrest. And obviously, what unions can do in a constructive way is to negotiate relocation of workers to other tasks and occupations, negotiate reductions in work weeks and more paid holidays and so on, if number of hours are being reduced. So unions can have a constructive way, a constructive role in the adoption process. they can also have a destructive role. So if you take the automation of the Paris subway, for example, and that took over a decade because unions blocked it. If you wonder why there's so few trains in Argentina, it's partly because the lorry unions is very strong and they don't want any competition. So it's important to remember that power is relative. It always will be. It's a zero-sum game, and if corporations are very powerful, then increasing union power to counterbalance that might be a good thing. If you have an economy which predominantly small enterprises with very little bargaining power, then unions have less of a role to play. And final point, the role of unions has always been changing as well and needs to continue to change, right? So we used to have craft-based unions during the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. With the rise of mass production industry, we shifted to industry level unions. And we're now moving away from a society which is predominantly based on mass production to more flexible working arrangements, often more decentralized economy. And I don't know exactly how unions need to structure themselves in the future, but if you think that going back to industrial relations of the mid-20th century is going to solve their problems, I think you're quite likely to be wrong.
Thank you, Carl. I can't resist adding a historical footnote, which is that recently I was looking at comparative surveys in Japan and various European countries on people's fears about technological unemployment. And technological unemployment fears were considerably less in Japan, despite its quite advanced use of, well, very advanced use of industrial robotics. And one of the interpretations that we came up for that finding was that in the 60s and 70s, when the manufacturing industry underwent rapid automation in Japan, there was a very strong, similar to Germany, very strong co-determination between workers and management in how the technologies were applied. And as a result, instead of technological unemployment, you had improvements in job quality and earnings. So the sort of public perception of technology is very positive in Japan, in contrast to some other countries where it was more of a creative destruction, Schumpeterian, rapid and rather less managed transformation. Okay, but moving on, and I hope we can return to this topic of how to manage this transformation at a future discussion. I'm going to pick now there's a couple of questions about essentially about the make or buy question. So Yannick Bermans is asking whether mid-sized firms should rely on AI outsourcing or over time develop in-house core competencies in AI. And there's a similar question from Philip Goebbels about whether I made the point that there is a need to reskill, let's say, doctors into AI skills, but is that actually necessary if rising connectivity makes it possible to very easily outsource that know-how and buy that in? And I see these are asking about the same thing. To what extent do companies need to develop these competencies in-house? Professor Krcmar, please.
It's very interesting to think which skills you can actually outsource and have other parties perform those skills. I think that might be a very nice observation. We usually tell pupils and students you can't outsource studying, you should do it yourself because it has to be in your brain in the end. But I think it's worthwhile to realize, yes, there are more of these cognitive aspects that can be outsourced, like observation of pictures in industrial computer vision done by something else, or an agent, a software agent. The crucial issue in outsourcing always remains whether one has enough capabilities and skills to judge the outcome of the outsourced activity and judge the quality of the activity performed. And of course, that changes dramatically if you really understand what the outsourced activity actually is. Determine cooking and eating in a restaurant. If you're cooking yourself, you have a different appreciation on what's going on than you just get it kind of from an outsourced vendor. And I think that's where the issue is, which of the skills and capabilities are at the core of an occupation, and which of these skills are kind of ancillary and might be performed without harm to the core of understanding in that occupation, and then can be done by other people. And that, I think, is something that needs a lot of discourse in the question on what should somebody with an occupation, whatever, actually do. There was a question in the round, what happens to fact-based scientific work? If it's just collection of facts, just collection of building material, can that be done via a cognitive robot? There are the first books out that do meta-analysis of papers by just doing that. Is that the creative combination of things to new houses if you just collect the building blocks? I think these are interesting questions.
Thank you very much. Did Dr. Neuburger, Dr. Frey, do you want to add anything?
Yes,
Neuburger, please.
One short comment. Sometimes it's difficult to find the important knowledge or the skills you need outside, and so it could be better to cooperate with institutions or to build up learning system and the development system inside to develop the necessary skills. It's not only make or buy. I think it's very complex.
Thank you very much. Not everything is available on the market is a very good point. Let's move on to another set of questions. So Lehdonvirta Laisuta, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, is asking what universities and study programs do to better develop the skills and competences among students, especially majors in humanities, social sciences, education, and economics. And then we have a related question from Matthias Pfaff, who is asking about the issue of lifelong learning, since we believe that needs for skills will continue to change. Will universities alone be able to transfer such knowledge in the future, or will something have to change here as well beyond university? So two questions, I suppose, if you want to pick one of those. What can and should universities do? And what can and should be done beyond universities?
I would like to start with the observation of lifelong learning, because it's obviously not a skill that you acquire once and then you're settled, partly because the technologies are expanding and changing relatively quickly. So the real issue is this under-generational change in context of technology that you can actually use. I happen to sit on a curriculum committee for the American Association of Collegiate School of Business, or MBA schools, and they're wondering what to change in the curriculum. And I would put it this way: the biggest issue is which skills are not necessary anymore. If you look at some of the students that do not complain that there's nothing to learn or nothing to acquire, on the opposite. So which could you leave away? And I think the area is to understand that learning is acquisition of skills and competencies, and the belief in self-efficacy in using these various technologies. And obviously that needs to be more instilled. And that's why I see the role of a university or an education institution to not destroy the curiosity of young people and their willingness to try things out, because we really can't control that easily. What exactly will there be necessary in their cognitive minds or in their crafts capabilities in 20 years down the road? And I think that's where the educational system has a very hard time going into an area where you cannot predict which exact skill is needed in 15 years, but more that this meta skill of joy in acquiring new stuff is interesting, whether that's on the physical or on the cognitive level. And I think that, at least from the German educational system, that tends to be, I would say, more rigid in terms of that's needed and that's not needed. And I think what really already started to be very specific in occupation type, it could also be very specific for the individual and what's necessary. And I think that makes it so difficult to predict which skills are needed. Universities starting to grapple with the fact that they can't promise the people that come along as students that's what they learn there is really absolutely positively necessary in 15 years.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to add my own observations to complementary observations to this from some research that we've done on how these independent professionals, I mentioned data scientists, consultants, animators, and so on, how they reskill themselves. And the first finding was that actually university qualifications and other formal regulated qualifications did not play almost any role in determining in our data set the pay that these professionals received, and they did not advertise their skills with their qualifications, which is a big difference to how I suppose in other sort of traditional labor market contexts, people put their qualifications at the top of their CV. And instead they reskilled using online courses and peer learning and on-the-job learning and so on. However, it would be a mistake to conclude from this that university education was unnecessary, because we also observed that these all of these independent professionals who were working online and rapidly reskilling themselves as technologies changed, all of them were much more highly educated in the traditional formal education system than the average for the labor force in that particular country. So lots of university graduates, lots of masters, and even PhD degrees. And we interpret this as showing that as Professor Krcmar pointed out, the metacognitive skills, the learning to learn, self-regulation, and all the other self-management skills, which you pick up in university training, are not less but more useful and valuable in this lifelong learning future of continuously changing skill needs. Now, unfortunately, it appears we've run out of time, and we still have many wonderful questions in the Q&A. So I regret that we will not be able to address them. I'm very pleased that the excellent interventions by the panelists generated such interest and discussion, and I do hope that we have a chance to address some of these questions in a future event. So please stay tuned for when TUM Heilbronn and the OII are organizing another seminar in this series. Professor Krcmar, would you like to say any concluding words before we finish the event?
I'd like to thank you, the panelists, for you really giving insightful issues and presentations into this fascinating topic of AI and work. And yes, really, we will do a second and third workshop in this series. That's why we started this series, and we hope that you, beloved participants, come to the second and third version of this workshop series. I think there's a lot of questions that need to be attended in detail. That's what I take away from our panel today, that the various perspectives, combining perspectives from different stakeholders, geographies, giving a diverse view on the issue helps us understand on how to move ahead. And with that, I would like to thank everybody. I would also like to thank the Dieter Schwarz Foundation that actually made it possible for to do our collaboration and is a starting point for that work on work and AI. And with that, I'd like to end you. Thanks a lot, and I hope to see you again. And if you would like to download material, I think you got many of the areas, and I hope we can answer the questions that we have seen in the next series of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.